Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a bit darker. A time of pharaohs, pyramids, and a whole lot of ways you wouldn't survive. We're stepping into ancient Egypt, a place where life was tough and death was just around the corner. Forget all those movies about grand temples and royal treasures. The truth? You wouldn't last a single day. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ready to find out why you wouldn't survive in ancient Egypt? Let's dive in. In ancient Egypt, life began with the sunrise. There were no alarms or clocks to wake people up. Instead, the start of the day was closely linked to the sun. There was no snooze button to hit, no bright digital numbers to look at, just the light of day streaming into homes, signaling the start of a new day. For the Egyptians, especially those in rural areas, life revolved around farming, and their daily routines were tied to the natural cycles of the Nile. Their activities were meticulously timed according to the seasons. It wasn't just about waking up early to work. It was a routine necessary for survival. As soon as the first rays of sunlight appeared, people would rise from their humble mud brick homes, often sleeping on simple mats or straw beds. The sunrise marked the beginning of a busy day, whether it was tending crops, herding animals, or preparing materials for the monumental structures they would build. The daily schedule for the common folk was largely influenced by the flood cycles of the Nile. During the annual inundation or the Akhet season, when the Nile flooded, the sun's rise was the signal for farmers to start planting. The rising sun was more than just a time marker. It was a necessity for their survival, a sign that the fertile land left behind by the floods was ready for planting. For the nobility and those in the cities, the day would also start with the sunrise, though their activities were more varied. Priests, scribes, and officials would begin their day early, preparing for religious ceremonies, writing, or attending meetings. Time was still dictated by the sun's position in the sky, and though their tasks were different, they too followed the natural rhythm of the day. There were no 5 a.m. alarms in ancient Egypt. Instead, life was synchronized with nature. People didn't wake up due to the urgency of a clock or the pressure of being somewhere on time. The sun itself was the cue for action. While there were sounds to help people wake up, roosters crowing or the sounds of the Nile flowing, these were natural signals, not mechanical ones. The whole community, from the poorest farmer to the wealthiest noble, started their day in harmony with the sun. There was no rush, no frantic scrambling to get to work. Life unfolded more steadily, guided by the natural cycles of the world around them. Interestingly, waking up with the sun was more in tune with the body's natural rhythm. People didn't fight against an artificial schedule. They weren't racing against the clock. There was no hurry to be anywhere. The physical demands of labor in the fields meant that mornings often began with quiet, purposeful activities before the harder work began. The absence of artificial light meant that night was truly dark, and people went to sleep early with the setting of the sun. Their daily rhythm was naturally aligned with the Earth's cycles, in contrast to today's constant artificial light and digital distractions. The sun wasn't just a practical timekeeper in ancient Egypt. It was also central to their spirituality. The sun god Ra was considered the creator of the world, the ruler of the day, and the one who gave life to everything. The Egyptians saw the rising sun as a symbol of rebirth, not just for the world, but for themselves. Each day was a continuation of the sun's journey across the sky, an eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Waking up with the sun was not only practical, it was an act of reverence to Ra, the god who governed the natural world. The night in ancient Egypt wasn't like the nights we know today. Without electricity or artificial lighting, the night was pitch dark and people generally went to bed soon after sunset. With no modern distractions to keep them awake, they followed a more natural sleep cycle. This natural rhythm of life, dictated by the sun, created a sense of order, peace, and harmony with the world around them. It was a simpler, quieter life, one where the world was marked not by the ticking of a clock, but by the steady, unhurried rise and fall of the sun. In the absence of the modern technological noise, life in ancient Egypt was deeply connected to the sun. The sun's daily cycle became a spiritual and practical guide, framing the entire rhythm of the day. It was a life that flowed according to nature, a life where the sun not only marked the time but was also seen as the very source of life itself. Waking up at sunrise was not just a routine, it was an integral part of their existence, shaping everything from work to worship, from the beginning of the day to the rhythm of their hearts. After we've imagined waking up to the sun's first light, there's another harsh reality of daily life in ancient Egypt that would make us reconsider our modern comforts: the way they slept. Forget about cozy beds, soft mattresses, or pillows to support your head. In ancient Egypt, the luxury of soft, supportive sleep was a distant dream for most people. For the average Egyptian, sleeping arrangements were incredibly basic. The majority of people slept on nothing more than simple mats made of straw, reeds, or palm fibers. These mats were rolled out on the hard, often cold floors of their homes, which were usually built from mud brick. The homes themselves were modest, small, dark, and with little in the way of insulation or comfort. No soft sheets, no fluffy pillows, just the ground beneath them and the minimal warmth of their bedding. Even for the wealthier Egyptians who lived in cities or had higher status, their sleeping arrangements weren't the plush experiences we might imagine. While they could afford slightly more structured mats or even simple wooden frames to sleep on, there was still no comfort comparable to our modern beds. Their sleeping spaces were often in the corners of the house, shared with family members, and in some cases, even animals. The lack of privacy and personal space meant that a restful night's sleep was a rare luxury. But it wasn't just about comfort. It was about the environment they lived in. The noise of the bustling streets and markets, the sounds of animals, and even the weather could make sleep difficult. Without modern windows or soundproofing, noise from the outside world often intruded into the home, making rest hard to come by. The heat of the desert nights, particularly in summer, only added to the struggle. With no air conditioning or fans, the rooms would often become stifling. Even the floor, which might have been cool at the start of the night, would absorb the heat, making it harder to sleep. And then there was the danger. The lack of proper bedding meant there was little to protect them from the elements. The floors were vulnerable to flooding, especially for those living near the Nile. When the river flooded, it could damage homes and turn the floor into a messy, muddy space. With no mattresses to keep them off the ground, they had to endure the discomfort of sleeping on a floor that could be wet, cold, or even infested with insects. While this might sound incredibly uncomfortable to us, it was simply the way life was. People adapted to their surroundings, and sleeping on the floor was just part of everyday life. Their bodies would become accustomed to the hard surfaces, and over time, they would find ways to make it bearable. But chronic pain and poor posture were inevitable side effects, and sleep wasn't as restorative as we know it today. Sleeping in ancient Egypt was far from luxurious, but it was part of a natural rhythm, much like waking up with the sun. Just as the day began with nature's light, the night ended with the harsh reality of nature's elements. The absence of soft beds and the struggles of sleeping on hard floors were just another challenge faced by the Egyptians in their daily lives. It wasn't comfortable, but it was a necessary part of their survival in a harsh world. And as we move forward in this video, we'll continue to see how every aspect of their lives was shaped by the conditions they faced, from waking up at dawn to enduring long days of labor on minimal rest. After waking up at sunrise and trying to rest on a rough straw mat or the bare floor, there's something else that would quickly make modern life feel like a forgotten luxury. Privacy. Or rather, the total lack of it. In ancient Egypt, the concept of personal space simply didn't exist the way we understand it today. Families lived together in small mud brick houses, often just 1 or 2 rooms, regardless of how many people lived under that roof. For most Egyptians, farmers, workers, craftsmen, their homes were compact and functional, not designed with comfort or privacy in mind. These houses were often built very close to one another in tight clusters, especially in villages or working districts near temples or royal projects. Inside, there wasn't much space at all. One room might serve as a living area, bedroom, and workspace all at once. Another, if they were lucky to have it, might be a small storage or cooking area. That's it. No walls dividing bedrooms, no doors to close, no place to go and be alone. Everything was shared: space, belongings, sleep, conversation, silence. If you were tired, you couldn't just escape to your room and shut the door behind you. There was no my space or your space. Children, parents, sometimes even extended family all slept and lived side by side. Privacy wasn't just rare, it was a completely foreign idea for most people. Imagine trying to fall asleep while others around you are talking, coughing, whispering, or moving, or trying to concentrate on a task during the day while your younger siblings play next to you, or someone's preparing food in the same room. For women especially, the lack of privacy could be even more limiting. There was little room for solitude or even a private conversation. Everything was done in the presence of others: eating, sleeping, working, giving birth, grieving. Even in wealthier households, privacy was still limited compared to modern standards. While nobles and high officials had larger homes, sometimes with courtyards, extra rooms, or upper floors, even these spaces were open, shared, and focused on family or servant interaction. Doors were rare, and rooms flowed into each other. Only the very elite might have had private chambers, and even those were rarely fully separated or soundproofed. So not only were people sleeping on hard floors and waking up with the sunrise, but they did it surrounded by everyone else in their household, every single day. For the modern viewer, used to having a bedroom, a quiet space, or even just the option to close a door, this would feel overwhelming. There was no retreat, no break from noise or eyes or voices. Your life was always lived together, out in the open for better or worse. Yet somehow this closeness also created a sense of community. It wasn't all struggle and frustration. People were deeply connected to their families. Children grew up surrounded by parents and grandparents. Meals were shared, stories told, and laughter echoed in tight spaces. But even so, the lack of personal space meant that emotions had to be contained, frustrations managed, and comfort redefined. In modern times, we often take solitude for granted. Stepping into another room, putting on headphones, closing the door. None of that was possible in the tight, sun-baked mud brick homes of ancient Egypt. And so, as we continue to walk through what daily life really looked like, it becomes more and more clear that surviving even a single day in their world would challenge not just our bodies, but our minds and patience as well. And as if sleeping on straw mats and sharing cramped spaces with your entire family wasn't difficult enough, there's something else that would test your limits from the moment you opened your eyes: the brutal, inescapable heat. In ancient Egypt, temperatures could easily soar past 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the shade. And unlike today, there was absolutely no escape. No air conditioning, no fans, no cool showers, just the sun, relentless, burning, and ever-present. It wasn't a matter of being hot for a few hours. It was a constant, suffocating pressure that pressed down on you from the moment the sun rose to the moment it disappeared behind the horizon. The mud brick homes, while slightly insulating, would trap heat throughout the day. The walls absorbed the sun's rays, and by late afternoon the interior could feel like a clay oven. Windows were tiny, and often there were no glass panes, just small openings to let in some breeze, assuming any breeze was even moving. But for most of the day the air was still and dry. Even shade offered little comfort. The desert climate didn't care where you hid. Water wasn't always within reach either. Though the Nile was central to life in Egypt, not every home had easy access to fresh, cool water. Water had to be fetched, stored in clay pots, and kept as cool as possible. But in that heat, it wouldn't stay cool for long. People often drank warm water and worked in the sun without any way to rehydrate quickly. There were no ice cubes, no cold drinks. Just warm liquid in your mouth while sweat rolled down your back. Clothing helped a little, but not much. Most people wore light linen garments, which allowed some airflow but offered little protection from the sun. For farmers and laborers, working under direct sunlight for hours meant constant dehydration, sunburns, and sometimes dangerous heat exhaustion. There were no sunglasses, no sunscreen, no hats with cooling fabric. Just basic cloth wrapped around the head, if anything. And if you happened to be doing physical labor, digging, hauling stone, or tending crops, you'd be drenched in sweat within minutes, with no relief until the sun finally went down. Sleeping was difficult too. Nights didn't always bring cool relief. After a long day of absorbing sunlight, homes would radiate stored heat deep into the evening. With no electricity, there were no fans to help circulate air, and certainly no climate control. People would lie awake sweating, rolling over on hard floors or mats, trying to find a slightly cooler spot, hoping for the smallest breeze to pass through a narrow window or rooftop. Even wealthier Egyptians, those with larger homes or courtyards, weren't immune to the heat. They may have had access to shade and servants who could wave palm fans, but that was hardly enough. The environment didn't discriminate. The heat touched everyone, and it shaped how Egyptians lived, worked, and even worshipped. Many religious rituals were timed around the movement of the sun because the sun was not only their god, it was their reality. In today's world, we adjust a thermostat and forget how brutal nature can be. But in ancient Egypt, the sun was a constant companion, both a giver of life and a daily torment. Every hour under its gaze was a test of endurance, and surviving a single afternoon without shade, cold water, or a fan, that might be more than most of us could handle. After sweating through another punishingly hot day, drenched in dust and grime, the natural instinct would be to seek relief, to cool off, to get clean. But in ancient Egypt, that meant turning to the one source of water that gave life to the entire civilization, the Nile. While we might picture it as a peaceful, flowing river under the sun, bathing in the Nile came with real danger. Risks that would make most modern people hesitate to even dip a toe. For most Egyptians, there were no private baths or showers. Running water in the home didn't exist. And though some wealthier citizens had basins or servants to help them wash, the average person relied heavily on the Nile for hygiene. People bathed in its waters, washed their clothes there, even drank from it. It was the center of their lives. But it was also a place full of unseen threats. Crocodiles lurked in the river's murky edges, especially in the southern regions. These weren't just a myth or rare occurrence. They were a genuine hazard. Nile crocodiles could reach over 5 meters in length and were known to attack without warning. Bathing or swimming in the wrong spot at the wrong time could end with someone never returning home. People knew the risks, but with no other practical option, many had no choice. And then there were the parasites. The Nile was a breeding ground for microscopic dangers, particularly schistosomiasis, a disease caused by parasitic worms that entered the body through the skin. It could lead to serious long-term health issues, damage to the liver, bladder, intestines, and more. But in ancient Egypt, without a microscope or modern medical knowledge, no one understood exactly how or why it happened. They just knew that some people got sick after swimming or bathing, but not everyone had the luxury to avoid it. Hygiene, as we know it today, didn't exist. Soap, in a crude form, did exist, made from animal fat and ash, but it wasn't widely available or always used. Washing usually meant scrubbing yourself with sand or rinsing with water pulled from the river. There was no toothpaste, no shampoo, no hot showers. And of course, without indoor plumbing, waste management was also primitive. Another reason people relied on the Nile to wash, rinse, and refresh themselves. Still, despite all the risks, cleanliness was actually important in ancient Egyptian culture. Priests bathed several times a day, and cleanliness was seen as a virtue, especially in religious contexts. But for the average worker, bathing might have been a quick rinse in muddy water at the riverbank after a long day in the fields, knowing full well the dangers that swam nearby. So while we might think of bathing as a relaxing, refreshing routine, in ancient Egypt it was often a matter of survival, trying to stay clean in a world full of dirt, sweat, and danger, without falling prey to the river itself. Every dip into the Nile was a gamble, one that most modern people wouldn't dare to take. Yet for the ancient Egyptians, it was just another part of daily life. Even after braving the Nile to clean off the day's sweat and dust, while dodging crocodiles and invisible parasites, the struggle didn't end there. If anything, it was just beginning. Because in ancient Egypt, disease wasn't just a seasonal worry or a background issue. It was everywhere, constant, inescapable, and with no antibiotics, no disinfectants, and barely any understanding of how infections actually worked, even the smallest scratch could be the beginning of something deadly. Let's start with the basics. There was no real soap, at least not the kind that killed germs or cleaned deeply. While the Egyptians did use some basic cleansing materials made from animal fat and alkaline salts, it was far from effective against bacteria. And bacteria were everywhere, with people walking barefoot or in open sandals, stepping through mud, waste, and riverbanks. Feet alone were a constant highway for infections. The homes themselves weren't exactly sterile environments. Built from mud brick and often shared with animals, the typical house was full of dirt, dust, and flies, so many flies. With no screens, no repellents, and food often left out in the open, flies moved freely from waste to meals to people's skin, carrying bacteria and disease with them. It was normal for wounds to fester, for eyes to become infected, for fevers to spread. And then there was the medical knowledge, or lack thereof. Egyptian medicine, for its time, was surprisingly advanced in terms of surgical tools and herbal remedies, and some treatments were written down on papyri with careful attention. But the true causes of disease, germs, viruses, parasites, were completely unknown. Illness was often blamed on spirits, curses, or angry gods. As a result, treatments were hit or miss, a mix of herbal concoctions, magical spells, or prayers to the gods of healing. If you got a tooth infection, there were no dentists as we know them, no numbing agents, no clean instruments, just a painful wait with swelling, fever, and possible death if the infection spread. Even something as small as a blister from working in the fields could turn into a serious wound. Tetanus, sepsis, dysentery, these were common killers. And without antibiotics, once a disease took hold, the body had to fight it alone. Waterborne diseases were also a major problem. People drank from the Nile, bathed in it, washed their clothes in it, and sometimes even dumped waste near it. Though it was a source of life, the river was also a carrier of sickness. Stomach illnesses, parasites, and skin infections were frequent, especially among the poor. Children were the most vulnerable. Infant mortality was high. Many didn't live past the age of 5. And even those who did often carried the physical signs of past illness. Stunted growth, deformed limbs, chronic pain. In fact, many ancient mummies show signs of infections in bones and teeth, evidence that disease was a daily reality. So imagine going through your day, working under a burning sun, sleeping on dusty floors, bathing in parasite-filled water, and knowing that if you got sick, help might not come. There were no clinics, no hospitals like we know them, and certainly no emergency rooms. People relied on traditional healers, family remedies, and hope. In our modern world, a visit to the doctor and a few pills might fix a problem in days. But in ancient Egypt, the same issue could become a life-or-death ordeal. It's one more reason why, if you were dropped into their world for just one day, your body and your immune system might not last very long. By this point in your imaginary day in ancient Egypt, you're hungry, exhausted from the sun, covered in dust, and probably nursing a few insect bites or a rash from your trip to the Nile. But don't get your hopes up. If you're picturing a table full of colorful fruits, roasted meats, or anything remotely resembling variety, think again. Because in ancient Egypt, your menu didn't change much. In fact, for most people, it barely changed at all. Bread, beer, and onions. Day after day for almost every meal. The backbone of the Egyptian diet was bread, dense, coarse, and by modern standards almost inedible. It wasn't the fluffy kind you'd find in bakeries today. Their bread was often gritty, made from emmer wheat and barley, and baked in clay ovens using hand-ground flour. Sounds simple enough, until you realize how that flour was made. Without metal tools, they ground the grain using stone grinders, basically rubbing 2 rocks together with the grain in between. Over time, tiny bits of stone would mix into the flour, so when the bread was baked and eaten, people weren't just consuming grains, they were chewing on sand, literally. Over years of eating this gritty bread, it wore down people's teeth to the roots. Archaeologists have found Egyptian mummies with teeth so eroded they likely suffered chronic pain every time they ate. And if you were hoping for meat, forget it. Only the wealthy could afford regular access to meat, fish, or dairy. For everyone else, it was a rare treat, maybe offered during festivals or religious ceremonies. Most meals were vegetarian by necessity, not by choice. Onions, leeks, lentils, garlic, and cucumbers were the main side dishes. They grew well in the Nile Valley and were cheap to produce. But when you're eating them for every meal, every day, the excitement fades quickly. As for drinks, clean water wasn't always guaranteed. Most people drank beer, not the foamy, fizzy kind we know today, but a thick, porridge-like brew made from fermented bread and water. It had very low alcohol content and was consumed by everyone, men, women, even children, because it was safer than untreated river water. But drinking that day after day didn't exactly feel refreshing. It was heavy, cloudy, and often filled with chunks of grain. To make things harder, food was heavily influenced by the season and your social class. A bad harvest meant less bread, fewer vegetables, and increased hunger. While Egypt was more stable than other ancient civilizations due to the Nile's predictable flooding, there were still years when the waters didn't rise as expected. That meant drought, famine, and serious food shortages for the entire population. Even if you had enough to eat, the lack of variety made nutritional balance nearly impossible. Protein was scarce. Vitamins, especially from fruits, were limited. Malnutrition, anemia, and vitamin deficiencies were common, particularly among children and laborers. Not to mention food spoilage. Without refrigeration, everything had to be eaten quickly or preserved using salt or drying, and that added even more limitations to the daily diet. So as you sit down in your mud brick home, exhausted, sweating, and hoping for a satisfying meal, what you actually get is a chunk of sandy bread, a raw onion, and a cup of warm, grainy beer. That's your dinner. Again. And you're going to have the exact same thing tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. After forcing down your meal of gritty bread, sharp onions, and cloudy beer, you might find yourself still thirsty. And naturally, in ancient Egypt, there's one place everyone turns to for water: the Nile. It's the heartbeat of the civilization, the great river that gives life to the desert. But if you're imagining a clean, refreshing stream of crystal-clear water, you're in for another rude awakening. The Nile may have been sacred, but it was far from pure. For most Egyptians, drinking water meant pulling it straight from the river or from clay pots filled earlier in the day. But there was no purification, no filters, no boiling for safety. The water you drank was the same water used for bathing, washing clothes, watering animals, irrigating fields, and sometimes even dumping human and animal waste. Every bucket was a gamble. What did that water contain? Parasites, for one. Lots of them. Tiny, invisible organisms like schistosoma worms that could burrow through your skin or enter your body when you swallowed even a few drops. These parasites would live inside the body for years, causing chronic illness, damage to organs, fatigue, and in some cases, even death. The people of the time had no idea what was causing their pain or sickness. They just knew it was part of life. Then there were bacteria. Without any understanding of germ theory, the concept of contaminated water didn't even exist. But the consequences did. Diarrheal diseases were rampant, especially among children. Typhoid, dysentery, and other gastrointestinal infections were common and often deadly. Clean drinking water was a luxury no one really had. If the water looked clear, that was the best you could hope for, but it didn't mean it was safe. And let's not forget waste. While temples and larger estates sometimes had rudimentary drainage systems, the average household had no plumbing. Waste, both human and animal, often ended up in pits near homes or was dumped near the riverbanks. When the Nile flooded, as it did every year, it washed over these areas, mixing waste back into the water supply and spreading contamination even further. People tried to work around this reality. They stored water in large jars made of porous clay, which helped cool it slightly. Sometimes they added herbs or settled it overnight to let the worst particles sink. But none of these methods actually removed the dangerous microorganisms. It was more about convenience and taste than health. Even the beer they drank, thick, fermented, and mildly alcoholic, wasn't completely safe. While fermentation helped reduce some bacteria, it didn't eliminate all of them. The beer dulled hunger and gave energy, but it didn't fully protect against waterborne illness. So when you raise a cup of Nile water to your lips, hoping to quench your thirst after a long, hot day, you're also taking in a cocktail of microbes, parasites, and pathogens. You can't see them. You can't taste them. But they're there. And in a few days or weeks you might find yourself with a fever, stomach cramps, or something far worse, with no doctor, no medicine, and no cure. Clean water, something we take for granted today, was one of the most dangerous necessities in the ancient world. In ancient Egypt, every sip came with a silent risk. a constant reminder that even the most vital source of life could turn against you. By now the sun is dipping toward the horizon, the heat hasn't let up, and you're still trying to digest your meal of sandy bread and sour beer. But you're already thinking about the next one. Dinner? Breakfast tomorrow? The problem is, there's no fridge, no pantry, no iceboxes, no preservation. Whatever food you have must be eaten now, or it might not be safe to touch later. This isn't just inconvenient. It changes everything about how people live. Every single day in ancient Egypt began with the same pressure. Find food, make food, and eat it before it turns. If you were a mother, a wife, or a servant, you spent hours grinding grain, fetching water, picking vegetables, preparing a fire, and cooking. Not because you were feeling inspired to try a new recipe, but because if you didn't cook it fresh, it wouldn't last more than a few hours. Bread could keep for a couple of days, if it was dry enough. But most other things, not a chance. Vegetables wilted fast in the heat. Meat, if you had it, spoiled within hours. Fish could rot before you even finished cleaning it. Milk? A warm, clumpy disaster by midday. And remember, we're talking about 40+ degrees Celsius, with no way to cool anything down. There were no sealed containers, no sterile jars. People used clay pots, woven baskets, or linen wraps. Flies and ants got into everything. Dogs and cats, or worse, rats, often snuck into storage areas. You might come back to find your only piece of meat crawling with maggots, or a rat having its own private feast inside your grain sack. The smell alone was overwhelming. Rotting onion, fermented beer, spoiled fish. Imagine walking into your home, a small, hot, mud brick room, and instead of the comfort of dinner, you're hit with the sour stench of yesterday's leftovers turning into mush. And it wasn't just unpleasant. It was dangerous. Rotten food could make you violently ill, especially in a world without hospitals or medicine. To cope, people had to eat early. Meals were rushed and practical. Cook it, eat it, move on. Nothing was saved for later. If there were leftovers, they were given to animals, dried out into hard, stale wafers, or simply left to rot. Sometimes people tried to sun-dry fish or salt it, but that only worked in certain regions and wasn't always reliable. Spoiled food meant wasted effort, and in a society where food took hours of labor to prepare, that could be devastating. Even water couldn't be stored for long. Left in an open jar, it would get dusty, buggy, or warm enough to taste like boiled mud. The clay jars helped cool it slightly, through slow evaporation, but that only worked for a short time. And still, no method could make it clean by modern standards. This daily cycle, harvest, grind, cook, eat, worry, was endless. Imagine the pressure on mothers trying to keep children fed, or on workers coming home exhausted, only to find that the food they were promised had already spoiled. So as you prepare for another restless night on a straw mat, think about this. There's no fridge humming softly in the background, no leftovers waiting, no cold drink. Just the knowledge that tomorrow you'll have to start over, from scratch, once again. And if the firewood is wet, or the grain is moldy, or the milk went sour in the heat, you might just go hungry. After a long day of surviving the heat, battling the flies, and dealing with the rotten, spoiled food, the moment to eat has finally arrived. You've managed to gather your bread, maybe a little bit of onion, and some stale beer. But what's missing? Utensils. In ancient Egypt, forks, knives, and spoons as we know them didn't exist. And it's not just that they were rare, they were almost completely unnecessary. Eating was done the old-fashioned way, with your hands. Yes, every meal, no matter how simple or luxurious, was eaten with your fingers. Bread, fruit, onions, vegetables, and even meat. Everything was handled directly by the hands. Forget about napkins or tissue. Anything that couldn't be easily eaten with your fingers had to be torn apart, or you might just use a piece of bread to scoop up some food. At first, this might sound a bit unsettling to modern sensibilities, especially in a world where eating with hands seems so unsanitary. But for the Egyptians, it was simply part of their daily routine. Imagine sitting around a communal table or at a low, simple table, as your family or coworkers tear off chunks of bread, pick up a piece of onion, and dip it into whatever they had, maybe some simple stew or the fermented grain beer. But eating with your hands didn't mean you didn't care about cleanliness. Egyptians were surprisingly aware of hygiene, even if they didn't have soap and modern antibacterial products. They washed their hands before eating, sometimes even several times a day, especially before religious rituals or after returning from working the land. Water for hand washing came from the Nile, so you'd likely dip your hands into the river, rinse off, and then prepare to eat. Now let's think about the more special occasions, the feasts. These were the rare moments when food could be more than just bread and onions. The elite would feast on meats like beef, ducks, geese, fish, and poultry, all cooked and prepared with various herbs, sauces, and spices. But even in these grand moments, you didn't get a knife and fork to cut up your roasted goose or lamb. Instead, large pieces of meat were hacked into manageable chunks, and people used their hands to tear at the flesh, gnawing and pulling apart the tender meat. No delicate cutlery to carve slices, no spoons to scoop stew. The tools were simply your fingers, maybe an occasional shard of bone to scrape meat off, or a piece of flatbread to scoop up grain, lentils, or stews. In fact, bread often served as an all-in-one utensil. You'd break off a piece of bread, use it as a scoop, wipe the plate clean, or push food into your mouth with it, almost like an edible spoon. And when you were done eating, the bread wasn't discarded. It became a cleaning tool. In a sense, you ate with bread and used it to wipe your hands. For them, there was no waste of any food. It all had a function. Now imagine eating like this day after day with each meal, whether humble or grand, relying on your hands. There's no precision or elegance. There's no sitting at a table, passing around forks and knives. The idea of personal space and etiquette around food didn't exist the way it does now. It's all raw, communal, and real. But in a world without refrigeration, without utensils, and without modern amenities, using your hands became second nature. It wasn't about comfort. It was about practicality and survival. Everyone ate together, family, workers, friends, sharing in the labor of cooking, the sweat of the day, and the joys of whatever small feast could be managed. At the end of each meal, your hands would be stained with oils, spices, and remnants of bread. Afterward, you'd rinse them in the Nile once more, or wash them in a bowl. But the process didn't stop there. Eating was just a small part of a cycle, one where hunger, satisfaction, and cleanliness were tied together in a constant struggle. The sun is scorching, sweat is dripping down your back, and you've just finished another long day working under the oppressive heat of Egypt's relentless summer. Now, as the evening cools, you turn to the simple, but essential, task of taking off your clothes for the night. But what you're wearing doesn't offer much relief. Your garments are made from linen, the most commonly used fabric in ancient Egypt. Linen was light and breathable, which made it ideal for hot climates. However, don't let its reputation for being breathable fool you. Linen wasn't always the soft, luxurious material we think of today. In fact, it could be incredibly itchy and uncomfortable, especially if it wasn't properly woven or processed. Unlike modern cotton or synthetic fabrics, the process of making linen was rough. The fibers were extracted from the flax plant, then spun into thread, and finally woven into cloth. The weaving process could be coarse and uneven, which meant that the fabric you wore could irritate your skin. It wasn't uncommon to feel that constant prickling sensation as the fibers rubbed against your skin, especially on long days when the linen clung to your sweaty body. But the worst part? There was no underwear. That's right. No soft cotton boxers or briefs to offer any protection. For men and women alike, the only thing separating your skin from that rough linen was the fabric of your tunic or simple loincloth. And considering the harshness of the material, chafing was a daily problem. If you spent hours walking, working, or sitting, the edges of your linen garment would rub against your thighs, hips, or shoulders, leading to painful raw spots. These sores could get infected or become irritated, making it even more uncomfortable to wear the same clothes day after day. For women, the situation was just as difficult. Their garments, typically a simple linen dress or sheath, offered little comfort or support. While the dress provided coverage, it didn't offer the luxury of softness, nor was it fitted for comfort in any way. The lack of undergarments meant that every movement, whether walking, bending, or even sitting, was met with the scratchy sensation of fabric rubbing against the skin. The absence of any form of personal protection or support must have made daily life feel like a constant battle to stay comfortable in the heat. And, as if this discomfort wasn't enough, linen clothes required a lot of maintenance. Unlike our easy care fabrics today, linen needed to be washed and dried carefully, and it could wrinkle easily, which added to the daily grind of keeping yourself presentable. Imagine being caught in the middle of the desert heat, wearing clothes that cling to your damp body and scratch your skin while trying to get through a full day of work. When you finally returned to your home, you wouldn't get the luxury of a hot shower or change into fresh clothes. The discomfort would stick with you for hours. Then there's the question of how long these garments would last. While linen could be durable, the constant friction of daily wear combined with the heat and sweat wore the fabric down over time. Clothes became frayed, torn, or faded. You would likely patch up holes as best you could, if you had the resources to do so, or just keep wearing the same uncomfortable, worn-out clothes. In ancient Egypt, comfort wasn't a luxury people were accustomed to. The idea of soft fabrics hugging the skin or the option to wear something gentle and supportive simply didn't exist. When you stripped down for bed after a long day, all that remained was the same rough linen against your skin, and perhaps a few hours of discomfort before you had to get up and face the heat and the itch again. Imagine waking up in the early morning, the heat of the day still hours away but already palpable in the dry air. You get up from your straw mat, stretch your sore muscles, and get ready to face another long day. But before you even step outside your mud brick home, there's one thing that will make the day even harder: the ground beneath your feet. If you're one of the poor, there's no luxury of shoes to protect your soles. Walking barefoot is just a fact of life. And this isn't some soft, grassy field you're walking on. This is hot sand, sharp stones, and rough, uneven ground that will tear at your feet with every step. The heat of the desert sun makes the sand scorching. Even in the cooler hours of the morning or evening, the ground is still painfully hot to the touch. You might wince as you step, trying to move quickly to avoid burning your feet. But no matter how fast you go, it's almost impossible to avoid the discomfort of hot sand seeping through your toes and scorching the bottoms of your feet. As you walk farther from the safety of your home, the ground becomes even less forgiving. Now it's not just sand, but sharp, jagged rocks, rough terrain, and uneven pathways that greet your bare feet. Every step is a gamble. A stone might jab painfully into the sole of your foot. A patch of hard earth could scrape and bruise your skin. And all the while you have no choice but to keep moving. No shoes to protect you from the pain. Shoes were a luxury reserved for the elite,
or for those who could afford the materials and time to make them. For the poor, it was simply too costly. The elite wore sandals, often made of leather or papyrus, which offered some protection against the harsh terrain. But for the common people, walking barefoot was just how it was. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. With every step you risked injury. The stones could tear at your feet, causing cuts or deep bruises. The sand could irritate your skin, and the dryness could lead to cracked heels and painful blisters. Infections were common and could quickly turn serious. A small cut could become infected, leading to painful abscesses, and with no access to antibiotics, these infections could easily become life-threatening. The combination of heat, rough terrain, and lack of proper foot protection made every day a struggle against physical pain and the risk of injury. And it wasn't just the sand or stones you had to worry about. Walking through crowded marketplaces, busy streets, or the muddy banks of the Nile meant that you were constantly at risk of stepping on nails, sharp debris, or even the occasional piece of broken pottery that could stab your feet. The ground was never truly safe, and the poor were always at risk of injury. This constant exposure to harsh surfaces also meant that foot health was a serious concern. The lack of proper foot care meant that people often developed calluses or deformities from walking barefoot day in and day out. Infections, open sores, and painful blisters were just part of life. Without shoes, there was no way to prevent the wear and tear of walking long distances or standing for hours at a time. In ancient Egypt, the idea of comfort or convenience when it came to footwear was simply not available to the majority. The poor had to adapt to the harshness of their environment, and the simple act of walking became a challenge in itself. Whether you were working in the fields, navigating the crowded streets of the city, or walking to the river to fetch water, the absence of shoes made life that much harder.
In ancient Egypt, beauty and appearance were essential aspects of daily life. But what you might not know is that the cosmetic products they used were far from safe. In fact, they could be downright toxic. The ancient Egyptians didn't just apply makeup for looks. It was also deeply embedded in religious rituals, personal care, and protection from the harsh environment. But the substances they used to achieve those flawless eyes and glowing skin often came with dangerous consequences. The most iconic cosmetic product in Egypt was kohl eyeliner, a dark powder used to outline the eyes. Today, kohl is often associated with a bold, dramatic look, but in ancient Egypt, it had more than just aesthetic value. Egyptians believed that kohl had protective powers against the evil eye, to ward off disease, and to shield the eyes from the harsh glare of the sun, especially in the desert. It was seen as a symbol of beauty, but also of spiritual and physical protection. However, there's a dark side to kohl. The primary ingredient in kohl was lead sulfide. This lead-based substance gave the kohl its dark color and long-lasting effect, but it was highly toxic. Over time, the repeated application of lead-based makeup could lead to lead poisoning, which caused a range of harmful effects, including abdominal pain, vomiting, headaches, and even brain damage. Yet despite the dangers, kohl was so central to Egyptian culture that it was widely used by both the elite and the common people, including children. The application of kohl wasn't just a beauty routine, it was a religious and ritualistic act. Priests and priestesses used it during ceremonies, and the pharaohs wore it as a symbol of their divine power. It was so important that even tomb paintings often depict the gods and goddesses wearing thick layers of kohl around their eyes, showing how deeply rooted this practice was in Egyptian society. Unfortunately, these revered traditions came at a great cost to health. But that wasn't the only toxic beauty product the Egyptians used. Perfumes and fragrances were another key element in personal care. The Egyptians loved sweet scents and used them liberally, especially in religious rituals or when preparing for feasts. However, the perfumes they used were far from the light, pleasant fragrances we know today. These perfumes were made by mixing fat, animal fat or vegetable oils, with herbs and flowers. While this may sound like an innocent concoction, the use of fat in perfumes could lead to clogged pores and skin issues. The oils would sit on the skin, attracting dust, dirt, and grime, creating a perfect environment for bacterial growth and skin infections. But the real concern came with the perfumed oils that contained fats mixed with harmful chemicals, which could irritate the skin or cause allergic reactions. People would often apply these heavily scented oils on their bodies to mask body odors, especially in the oppressive heat of Egypt. These oils, while initially giving off a pleasing scent, had long-term negative effects on skin health and hygiene. Despite the dangers, the Egyptians continued to use these products, as they were seen as signs of status and wealth. Perfumes were often a luxury, used only by the elite, but kohl was accessible to most, even the commoners. In fact, the more makeup one wore, the more it signified beauty, power, and spirituality. The use of cosmetics in ancient Egypt wasn't just about enhancing appearance. It was a part of everyday survival, a way to protect oneself from the elements, and a spiritual connection to the divine. But the irony was that the very products used to protect and beautify also had toxic, dangerous side effects that most people didn't fully understand at the time. When it came to personal care and beauty, hair removal was a key aspect of life in ancient Egypt. Both men and women sought smooth, hair-free skin, not just for reasons of beauty, but also for hygiene and fashion. However, the methods used to remove body hair weren't exactly the gentle, painless processes we're used to today. Instead, they relied on painful and often harsh techniques that left their mark on the skin. One of the most popular methods of hair removal in ancient Egypt was using a sugary paste, similar to the modern technique of sugaring. This paste was made from a mixture of sugar, water, and lemon, a combination that was both effective and sticky. The paste would be applied to the skin, where it would adhere to the hairs. Then, with a quick motion, the paste was pulled off, ripping out the hair at the root. This was a painful process, as anyone who has tried waxing or sugaring today can imagine. The hair was pulled directly from the follicle, leaving behind raw, irritated skin. Sugaring wasn't just about removing body hair. It also had a connection to hygiene. In a hot, dry climate like Egypt, having less body hair helped reduce sweat and body odor. Hair traps moisture and bacteria, so by removing it, people believed they were promoting cleanliness. Additionally, hairless skin was seen as smooth, youthful, and fashionable. Egyptian men and women both preferred to have hair-free faces, legs, and armpits, as well as smooth skin on their heads, especially among the elite. But it wasn't just sugary paste that people used to remove hair. In fact, for a more permanent hair removal solution, Egyptians turned to stone razors. These razors were made from materials like flint, obsidian, or copper, and were incredibly sharp. They weren't as efficient or comfortable as modern razors, and they required skill to use properly. You would need to carefully shave away the hair, but given that the tools weren't exactly designed for comfort, shaving could be a painfully slow and difficult process. The use of stone razors was a common practice, especially among men who might want to maintain a clean-shaven look, in contrast to the rough, unkempt appearance that could come from not removing facial hair. Women also used these razors to keep their skin smooth, especially on their arms, legs, and faces. It's important to note that these stone tools often caused cuts, nicks, and abrasions, leaving the skin vulnerable to infection. For both methods, whether it was the sugary paste or the stone razors, the painful aftermath was inevitable. The skin could become irritated, red, and inflamed, especially when hair was pulled out from the root. Infections were a real risk, as there were no antibiotics to treat cuts or abrasions. After hair removal, people would sometimes apply oils or ointments to soothe the skin and prevent irritation. But the risk of infection or prolonged redness was a constant concern. Despite the discomfort and pain involved, hair removal was considered essential for maintaining personal cleanliness and adhering to the fashion trends of the time. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about living a life that was in harmony with the standards of Egyptian society. Smooth, hairless skin was not just desirable. It was a symbol of status and respectability. Hair removal was also tied to the idea of divinity. The Egyptians believed that gods and goddesses were flawless, and part of being divine was having immaculate skin, free of hair. Therefore, the practice of removing hair was not only a practical matter, but a way of aligning oneself with the divine, maintaining purity and embodying beauty. Imagine stepping into a typical mud brick house in ancient Egypt. The first thing you'll notice is how small and cramped the space feels. Unlike the spacious, air-conditioned homes we're used to today, these homes were built with minimal room, often designed to accommodate entire families in a confined area. The mud brick construction, though sturdy and well-suited for the hot, dry climate, was not particularly effective at providing comfort or ventilation. Most people lived in houses with just 1 or 2 rooms, often shared by multiple generations. The layout of the home was extremely simple, usually consisting of a main living space, a small area for sleeping, and possibly a few storage spaces. The rooms were divided by simple walls, and furniture was minimal. You wouldn't find soft chairs, plush sofas, or comfortable beds. Instead, people slept on mats or small platforms made of reeds, or on the bare floor, surrounded by little privacy. The interior of these houses was dark and poorly lit. The homes had no windows or very small ones, which allowed little natural light to enter. The primary source of light came from oil lamps or torches, casting only a dim glow over the cramped space. The lack of windows meant that the air inside could become stale and smoky, especially when people used fire for cooking or warmth. The smoke would linger, creating a hazy atmosphere and making it difficult to breathe. During the hot Egyptian summers, these homes would become unbearably hot. The thick mud brick walls did little to keep the heat out, and with little air circulation, the interior temperatures could rise to uncomfortable levels. Families didn't have the luxury of fans or air conditioning to cool off, so they would have to rely on simple solutions like opening the door or sitting near the river in the evenings when the temperature dropped slightly. But the most striking part of living in these homes wasn't just the cramped conditions or the heat. It was the shared living spaces. In many homes, the family wasn't alone. They shared their living space with animals, often goats, donkeys, or chickens. These animals were important for providing food, milk, and transportation, but they also contributed to the unpleasant conditions inside. The homes would smell of animal waste, and the noise of the animals could make it difficult to sleep or even have quiet moments of rest. Families didn't have the luxury of a private space to retreat to. In such tight quarters, everyone was forced to coexist in the same cramped environment, dealing with the challenges of space, smoke, and noise, all while trying to maintain their daily lives. The lack of privacy was a stark contrast to the way we think about personal space today. For many Egyptians, this wasn't just about physical discomfort. It was also about a lack of personal boundaries. The materials used to build these homes, mud brick, palm fronds, and reeds, were inexpensive and available, but they didn't offer much protection from the elements. During the rainy season, the walls of these homes could become soft and even collapse, leaving families vulnerable to the elements. The houses didn't provide insulation or any effective way to protect against extreme weather.
which meant that living conditions were often harsh and required constant repairs. In these homes, the reality of daily life wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. Families had to make do with what they had, finding ways to adapt to the difficult conditions. But despite the cramped space, smoke, and the lack of privacy, people found ways to live and even thrive, developing close-knit communities where family and cooperation were vital to survival.
In ancient Egypt, the challenges of daily life went far beyond cramped spaces, harsh weather, and limited privacy. One of the most persistent and unbearable problems that Egyptians faced in their homes was the constant presence of insects and vermin. Imagine trying to rest or carry out your daily chores, only to be interrupted by the relentless presence of flies, fleas, and even scorpions. Living in homes made of mud brick and reeds, these structures were far from sealed off from the natural world. The tiny cracks in the walls, the open doorways, and the lack of windows made it easy for pests to invade. The homes, though sturdy against the sun's heat, were completely open to the many creatures that thrived in the warm, humid environment near the Nile River. Flies were among the most common and irritating of these pests. With the lack of sanitation, flies were drawn to the waste, leftover food, and animal excrement that piled up around homes. The Egyptian people didn't have the modern conveniences of trash collection or effective waste management systems. Leftover food, animal droppings, and waste were often left to decompose in open areas or near the living space, attracting flies and other insects. These flies would swarm into homes, making everyday life an uncomfortable and unsanitary affair. It wasn't uncommon for Egyptians to spend hours swatting flies from their faces and food, fighting off the irritation and constant buzzing. Fleas, too, were a huge issue. With people living in close quarters, often sharing their homes with domestic animals like goats, sheep, and dogs, fleas would find their way into homes as well. These tiny parasites would feed on the blood of both humans and animals, causing intense itching and discomfort. The fleas would often live in the beds, clothing, and animal fur, further complicating life for those already struggling with other issues. Bathing was not a frequent practice, and with limited resources to deal with these pests, people had to endure the constant discomfort of flea bites. The dangers were not limited to these smaller pests. Scorpions were another very real threat that people had to deal with on a daily basis. The hot, dry climate of Egypt was the perfect environment for scorpions to thrive, and they often found their way into homes, seeking shelter in the cracks of the walls or in dark, hidden corners. A sting from a scorpion could be fatal, especially if medical help wasn't available. In fact, many Egyptians carried a small amulet or charm as protection against scorpion stings, a reminder of how serious this threat was. These insects and vermin posed significant health risks as well. Flies were known to spread disease by carrying bacteria and parasites, especially in an environment where hygiene was difficult to maintain. They would spread germs to food and water supplies, increasing the risk of foodborne illnesses and intestinal diseases. Fleas could also transmit other parasites, such as tapeworms, and contribute to infections that could worsen without proper medical care. Scorpions, on the other hand, posed a threat not only in terms of injury, but also because their presence highlighted the general lack of pest control or effective management systems. The constant presence of pests made life in Egypt even harder. Insect bites could lead to irritation, infections, or allergic reactions, and having to deal with these problems on a daily basis created a hostile living environment. With no modern insect repellents or ways to eliminate pests, Egyptians had to rely on smoke, herbs, or natural remedies to try and keep insects at bay. Burning incense or resin was one way to repel flies and other insects,
but it was far from foolproof. The real solution, of course, would have been to have a cleaner, more sealed-off living space, but that was a luxury that few could afford.
One of the most difficult aspects of daily life in ancient Egypt was the complete lack of modern sanitation. Imagine living in a time where there were no toilets, no plumbing, and no running water. Waste disposal was a significant challenge, and it wasn't something that could be hidden away in the privacy of a bathroom as we know today. Instead, the Egyptians had to deal with crude, basic methods of waste disposal, making their living conditions even more uncomfortable and unsanitary. In the absence of toilets, Egyptians had to make use of the open spaces around their homes for relieving themselves. This meant that public urination and defecation were common, especially in crowded urban areas or villages. The lack of privacy meant that waste disposal became a communal affair, with little to no effort made to keep it out of sight or contained. Open pits, often dug just outside homes or along the edges of villages, were used as makeshift toilets. People would go to these areas to relieve themselves, which created not only an unpleasant environment, but also a significant health hazard. For wealthier families or those who could afford it, there were some more private options, like small latrines or sewers. However, these were extremely rare and not widely available to the general population. Most of the time, people used simple containers, which they then disposed of in nearby streets or pits, further contributing to the public visibility of waste. In larger cities like Thebes or Memphis, waste might be thrown into the streets, or perhaps down into open drains that ran along the sides of the streets. This meant that the streets were constantly littered with waste, which created a strong odor and made the environment filthy and hazardous to walk through. The Egyptians didn't have access to modern sewage systems, so there was no way to properly manage waste. In rural areas, the situation was even more basic. Most people would simply dig a hole in the ground and dispose of their waste there. These pits, once full, would have to be covered, and families would dig new ones elsewhere. This meant that in many places the sanitary conditions were extremely poor, and the contamination of water supplies was a real concern. The Nile, being the primary source of water for the Egyptians, was at risk of contamination by human waste, particularly as it flowed through more populated areas. The lack of privacy and the lack of hygiene led to a much higher risk of diseases. Without any understanding of the dangers of contamination or germs, people would often drink from or bathe in contaminated water, unknowingly exposing themselves to diseases like dysentery, cholera, or typhoid. The inability to wash or clean themselves properly, combined with poor waste disposal, contributed to the spread of infections and contributed to the general low life expectancy. Despite these poor sanitation practices, the Egyptians were known to take care of their personal cleanliness in other ways. Bathing, as we've already discussed, was a part of their culture, but the lack of a proper waste disposal system made hygiene and public health much more difficult to maintain. In larger settlements, there were some more advanced waste management systems in place. Some cities had basic drainage systems, where waste would be carried away through channels, although these were far from effective in dealing with the volume of waste. These drainage systems would often carry both stormwater and human waste, mixing the two into the same flow, which made the sanitation situation only marginally better. Even in these cities, though, people often still relied on the open disposal of waste, either by throwing it into the streets or burying it near their homes. The absence of proper toilets and plumbing not only made the day-to-day life of Egyptians difficult, but also presented significant health and environmental challenges. Without any modern waste management practices, waste became a constant problem that needed to be managed by the people themselves, with little to no help from the infrastructure around them. The lack of privacy,
the crude methods of disposal, and the general unsanitary conditions would have been incredibly difficult to live with, especially considering the hot, dry conditions that could turn waste into a breeding ground for diseases.
In ancient Egypt, the majority of people spent their days performing hard manual labor under the relentless Egyptian sun. Life was physically demanding, especially for the lower classes, who bore the brunt of the heavy work. Farming, quarrying, hauling stones, and other forms of physical labor were the backbone of the Egyptian economy, but they also represented the harshest aspects of daily life. Let's start with farming, which was the primary occupation for most Egyptians. Despite the Nile providing the vital water supply that made agriculture possible, working the land was still a labor-intensive and physically demanding task. Farmers would spend long hours under the sun, plowing fields, planting seeds, and harvesting crops. The basic tools they used, like wooden plows and sickles, were primitive by today's standards. There were no modern tractors or machinery, so everything was done manually, often with the help of oxen or donkeys. However, the animals could only do so much. The majority of the work was carried out by the farmers themselves, who worked from dawn till dusk in the heat of the day. The intensity of the labor was not the only challenge. The work was also grueling and repetitive. Irrigating the fields to ensure the crops thrived in the often harsh environment was a constant challenge, and the work was typically done in very long shifts. Farmers had to deal with everything from heavy flooding to droughts that could destroy their crops. The Nile's annual flooding was a crucial event for farming, but if the floods were too high or too low, it could result in a poor harvest, leading to starvation and economic instability. Aside from farming, quarrying was another extremely physically demanding task that required the workforce to spend long hours working with large stones. Workers would travel to quarries, often located far from settlements, to extract the limestone, granite, or sandstone used to build the grand pyramids, temples, and tombs that Egypt is so famous for. The stone-cutting process involved using rudimentary tools like copper chisels and wooden mallets to break apart large blocks of stone. The work was dangerous as the tools could break, and workers were exposed to the constant risk of injury from falling stones or sharp tools. They had to chisel away tirelessly through the stone under the oppressive heat of the sun. The workers were often exposed to dust and debris that could make breathing difficult, and there was no escape from the harsh conditions. In addition to quarrying, another incredibly tough job was hauling stones. After the stone blocks were cut, they needed to be transported to the construction sites of monumental structures like the pyramids and temples. This was no easy task. The stones could weigh several tons, and workers used sledges, rollers, and sometimes ropes to drag them across the desert. The terrain made this process even harder, as they had to maneuver these enormous stones across rocky, uneven ground or through sandy deserts. Men would pull the sleds together, working in teams for hours on end, sometimes without rest. The heat, the weight of the stones, and the exhaustion would have been overwhelming. This manual labor was essential to Egypt's economy, but it wasn't just physically exhausting. It was also socially demanding. While the elite enjoyed a more comfortable lifestyle, the majority of the population, especially those in the lower social classes, were forced to perform these laborious tasks without the luxury of time off or fair wages. The workers often lived in substandard conditions, with little comfort or protection from the sun. They were at the mercy of their employers, with few rights or protections to ensure their well-being. Many of these laborers worked in gangs, which meant their movements and actions were constantly monitored. They could be punished for poor performance or lack of progress, adding to the psychological stress of the labor. Even skilled craftsmen who worked on elaborate artwork, intricate stone carvings,
or pottery-faced, grueling hours of work. The conditions in which they worked were difficult as well. The stone dust would accumulate in the air, making it hard to breathe, and their workstations were often located in poorly ventilated areas. Skilled laborers, like those working on the royal tombs or in the pharaoh's palace, often worked under the watchful eyes of overseers, and were pushed to meet the high standards of the elite. Moreover, there was always the constant threat of being drafted into one of these labor forces, especially when the pharaoh decided to embark on ambitious building projects, like the construction of pyramids or temples. The workers were often conscripted to work on these monumental projects as part of their taxes or royal duties. They had little choice but to comply, as disobedience could result in severe punishment. These forced laborers might spend years working on the construction of a single temple or pyramid under brutal conditions and with little regard for their welfare. In ancient Egypt, society was organized into a strict hierarchical structure with little room for mobility or social advancement. At the top of this hierarchy were the elite, including the pharaoh and the nobility, followed by scribes, artisans, and priests. Beneath them were the farmers, laborers, and construction workers, those who toiled under the harsh sun to build the magnificent temples and pyramids that Egypt is famous for. And then, at the very bottom of this rigid social pyramid, were the slaves, people who had no rights, no freedom, and who were forced into hard labor for their entire lives. The social system was incredibly stratified, and there was little to no opportunity to move between classes. The concept of a middle class as we know it today didn't exist. The vast majority of Egyptians were either peasants toiling away in the fields or laborers working on monumental construction projects, or they were part of the slaves or servants who performed the hardest, most dangerous tasks. Slavery in ancient Egypt was somewhat different from the way we think of it today. People became slaves in various ways. Through war, where prisoners were taken and forced into servitude. Through debt, where a person could sell themselves or their family members into slavery to pay off their debts. Or through birth, if a child was born into slavery. Slaves could be found in all kinds of environments, working in the fields, building pyramids, or performing household tasks for the wealthier classes. Despite their hard work, slaves had very little control over their lives. They had no personal freedom and could be bought and sold at will. Property was what defined your status in society, and slaves were often considered the property of the elite, especially the pharaoh. They were often given the most grueling tasks, like hauling heavy stones for construction projects or working in dangerous environments such as the gold mines. These people were not seen as individuals, but as tools or property, exploited and oppressed for the benefit of the elite. The elite class, including the pharaoh, lived in stark contrast to the laboring classes. They had access to luxurious palaces, feasts, and extravagant clothing, while the workers and slaves lived in cramped quarters and had to survive on meager diets. The pharaoh, who was considered a god on earth, ruled over everything, and his power was absolute. The priests, scribes, and high-ranking officials were also part of the elite class, and their status came with privileges that no one in the lower classes could even dream of. Priests held significant power because they had control over the religious practices of Egypt. They had their own wealth, land, and servants, and their influence reached far beyond just religious matters. They also played a key role in governance and law. Scribes, too, were held in high esteem, as they were the only ones who could read and write. They had the privilege of working in government offices or serving the elite in royal palaces. These professions were passed down from one generation to the next, ensuring that the elite maintained their power and influence. For those who were part of the working class, life was harsh. Farmers and artisans worked long hours under the sun, doing physically exhausting tasks with little in return. They were often forced to pay taxes in the form of labor or goods, which left them with even less time for rest or leisure. Unlike the elite, they had no voice in the political affairs of Egypt, and could be subjected to severe punishments if they disobeyed their superiors. Workers and farmers lived in cramped homes and had to survive on a basic diet, often consisting of bread and beer. Their lives were dictated by the seasons of the Nile, with little to no control over their destiny. The lack of a middle class meant that there was no social mobility. If you were born a farmer, you stayed a farmer. If you were born a slave, you stayed a slave. There was little opportunity to change your status or rise above your circumstances. While some workers or slaves might have had the chance to become trusted servants or skilled artisans, it was rare, and it was not a given that such opportunities would be available to everyone. The system was designed to maintain the power of the elite and prevent any real challenge to the status quo. Punishments for breaking the strict rules of society were severe. Workers who were caught stealing or attempting to escape their labor might be severely punished, and slaves who disobeyed their masters could be flogged, maimed, or even executed. In the eyes of the elite, these punishments were justified, as the lower classes were seen as tools to maintain the grandeur of Egypt, not as individuals with their own rights or dignity.
In ancient Egypt, justice was often swift and unforgiving, especially when it came to the lower classes. The punishments for small mistakes were brutal, and there was little mercy for those who stepped out of line. Whether it was a mistake made by a worker, a farmer, or a slave, the consequences were harsh and could involve whippings, forced labor, or even worse, depending on the severity of the offense and the social status of the person involved. For the working class, those who were not part of the elite, mistakes made on the job could result in severe physical punishment. If a laborer was seen as inefficient or failed to meet expectations on a building project, they could be subjected to flogging or beatings. The physical punishment of workers was often done publicly, as a means to deter others from making the same mistake. Whippings were meant to send a message about the importance of discipline and order in a society where there was no room for failure when it came to serving the pharaoh or the elite. Slaves, who were at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, faced the harshest treatment. If a slave were caught trying to escape or defy their master in any way, the punishment could be severe, from being flogged to having their limbs cut off, or worse. Slaves had no rights or protection under the law, and their bodies belonged to their masters. They were seen as property rather than people, and any sign of disobedience or rebellion could result in severe physical harm or even death. This ruthless system of control kept the slaves in check and ensured that they did not rise up against their harsh conditions. For those in higher positions, like scribes or priests, punishments were often less physical, but still carried serious consequences. A mistake in a legal document or a religious transgression could lead to public disgrace, loss of position, or banishment. These individuals were often valued for their knowledge and social standing, so any offense would result in damage to their reputation or their career. In some cases, punishment could mean being ostracized from the elite circles, effectively removing them from power and influence. For the elite, the punishment was more about social exclusion rather than physical pain. However, physical punishment wasn't the only way people were dealt with harshly for small mistakes. Forced labor was another form of punishment, especially for those who had committed crimes like theft or dishonoring their masters. Individuals could be sentenced to work on the harshest construction projects, like hauling stones, working in mines, or serving in the fields.
This kind of forced labor often meant working under the sun, in brutal conditions, for long hours without rest. It was a grueling and exhausting punishment that many would try to avoid at all costs. In some cases, people who made mistakes or committed crimes could be imprisoned. Although prisons in Egypt were not as common as they are today, some forms of confinement existed, such as guarded areas where offenders would be held. These prisons, though, were not places of reform or rehabilitation. Instead, they were often used as temporary holding areas before individuals were either released or subjected to further punishment. Those who were sent to prison faced the possibility of forced labor, whipping, or other harsh treatments, depending on the severity of their crime. The harsh legal system of Egypt was built on the principle of order and discipline. In such a rigidly structured society, there was little room for mistakes, especially for those in the lower classes. The penalties for small errors were intended to maintain control, enforce the social hierarchy, and ensure that everyone knew their place. In a way, these punishments were not just about dealing with the offenders. They were also a means of social control, sending a message to everyone else about the consequences of disobedience. Though the punishment system was brutal, it was also effective in maintaining the stability of Egyptian society. People were aware of the consequences of their actions, and most understood that stepping out of line would bring about severe punishment. The elites and rulers of Egypt had a strict hold on power, and part of that power came from the ability to enforce strict discipline among their people, whether they were workers, slaves, or even the elite. In this sense, Egypt's society was one where order and obedience were prioritized above everything else, and mistakes, no matter how small, came with dangerous consequences. In ancient Egypt, women enjoyed certain rights and privileges that were uncommon in many other ancient societies. They had the ability to own property, inherit wealth, and engage in legal transactions. However, while these rights might seem progressive for the time, they were still bound by a strict societal framework that placed limits on their freedom and autonomy. Women had rights, but their freedom was often restricted by the expectations of their roles as wives, mothers, and daughters. Women could own property just like men. This was a significant advancement compared to other ancient cultures where women had very little control over their assets. In Egypt, women could inherit property from their families, buy and sell land, and even manage their own wealth. Widows, in particular, were able to keep their inheritance and run households independently. This sense of financial agency allowed women in Egypt a degree of independence, especially in household matters and family businesses. Moreover, women could engage in legal contracts, like marriage agreements or business partnerships, and were often responsible for overseeing domestic wealth. Royal women had access to significant amounts of wealth and land, though most of the time it was controlled by men in the royal family or the pharaoh. Some women, especially in the elite class, could manage estates and play roles in overseeing agricultural lands or trade. Despite these rights, the expectations placed on women were often tied to their relationship to men. Marriage was one of the most important aspects of a woman's life, and her role within the household was often defined by her relationship to her husband. A woman was expected to be a good wife, mother, and caregiver, and her primary responsibility was to maintain the household and bear children. In a society that valued family and lineage, women's roles were seen as essential, but not in a way that allowed them much individual freedom outside of their household duties. Women were expected to obey their husbands and fathers, especially in the case of marriage arrangements. While they could own property and make legal decisions, many of those decisions were still influenced by the male members of their family or the state. A woman's actions and choices were often closely monitored, and while she had some degree of legal autonomy, she still operated within a patriarchal society where the men held ultimate power in the family and community. Marriage was not just a romantic or personal arrangement, but also a social contract, and a woman's status and opportunities in life were often linked to her relationship to a man. In public, women were rarely involved in politics or decision-making at the state level. The pharaoh, the highest authority in the land, was almost always a man, and while there were some exceptions, such as Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, these were rare and exceptional cases. Royal women, though highly respected, often had to navigate a system where their power was limited by their male counterparts. Royal wives and mothers were influential behind the scenes, but their power was often only as great as the influence they had over their sons or husbands. Despite the limitations placed on their freedom, elite women in Egypt enjoyed lives that were privileged in comparison to women in many other societies. They had access to education, luxury goods, and the ability to make decisions regarding their households and finances. However, they were still expected to abide by the traditions and expectations of a patriarchal society, which was focused on order, family, and dynasty. For women of the lower classes, life was more restrictive. They were primarily engaged in domestic tasks such as cooking, weaving, and managing the household. Many worked as laborers in agriculture, in the home, or even in markets, but their lives were often spent fulfilling roles defined by their families and their husbands. Women in lower classes had fewer opportunities for personal freedom and were typically subject to the control of their male family members. However, it is worth noting that women had influence in areas of life that revolved around spirituality and rituals. Women could serve as priests in religious ceremonies and hold positions in temples. Gods and goddesses in Egyptian mythology often had powerful female counterparts, like Isis, the mother goddess, or Hathor, the goddess of love and fertility, giving women a symbolic connection to power through religion. At the end of the day, though women in ancient Egypt enjoyed certain rights and privileges that were groundbreaking for their time, their freedom was still constrained by a patriarchal structure that placed men at the top of the social hierarchy. The tension between the rights they had and the freedom they lacked was a central aspect of their existence, and it shaped how they navigated their roles in society.
Women may have had legal autonomy, but their lives were still firmly defined by the social expectations placed on them by a male-dominated society. In ancient Egypt, religion wasn't just a part of life, it was life itself. The Egyptians lived in a world dominated by gods and spirits, and their daily routines were deeply tied to the practice of rituals, offerings, and a constant fear of divine punishment. Religion wasn't confined to a single day or special occasion. It was interwoven into every aspect of daily life, from waking up in the morning to the rituals surrounding death and the afterlife. Endless rituals were part of daily life for almost everyone, regardless of their social class. For the elite, religion was particularly important because it was thought that their relationship with the gods directly influenced their wealth, power, and the stability of the kingdom. Pharaohs, as the earthly embodiments of gods, had an immense responsibility to maintain the gods' favor through ceremonies, temple offerings, and rituals. It was believed that failure to appease the gods could bring about calamities, such as famine, disease, or even the fall of the empire itself. For common people, the gods were just as omnipresent, but their relationship with the divine was more practical, focused on ensuring fertility, health, and protection. They would make regular offerings to various gods such as Ra, the sun god, Isis, the goddess of motherhood, and Osiris, the god of the afterlife, hoping to receive blessings or to ward off misfortune. Households would often have small shrines with statues of their personal gods, offering them food, incense, or libations to ensure peace and prosperity in their daily lives.
The taboos in Egyptian society were also deeply connected to religious beliefs. There were certain actions and behaviors that were considered not just socially unacceptable, but also spiritually dangerous. Breaking taboos could bring divine wrath, so people would go to great lengths to avoid violating religious rules. This included everything from the food they ate, to the ways they dressed, to the actions they took in public. For instance, it was considered sacrilegious to speak the name of certain gods in vain, or to neglect the proper burial rites of the dead. The fear of offending the gods permeated everyday life, creating a sense of spiritual anxiety that was always present. At the temples, religious leaders conducted elaborate rituals to honor the gods, often involving sacrifices and prayers. These ceremonies were not only performed to maintain the gods' favor, but were also believed to ensure that the cosmic order of the universe, known as Ma'at, remained in balance. The gods were thought to have a direct hand in the affairs of the living world, and their influence could be felt in everything from the rising of the Nile to the success of crops, to even the health of a family's children. The fear of divine retribution was a powerful motivator. Misfortune or disaster was often interpreted as a sign of the gods' anger. For example, if crops failed, it was believed to be a sign that the gods were displeased. If a disease or plague struck, it was thought that the gods were punishing the people for a collective spiritual failing. As a result, Egyptians often sought out ways to appease the gods, such as penitential rituals, fasting, or giving larger offerings to temples in hopes of winning back favor. The fear of the afterlife also played a central role in religious practices. The journey after death was a terrifying unknown, and Egyptians believed that failing to properly honor the gods during life could result in a horrific afterlife. The weighing of the heart ritual, which determined whether a person's soul would be allowed to enter the fields of reeds, a type of paradise, was a deeply spiritual and public affair. If the heart of the deceased was deemed heavier than the feather of Ma'at, representing truth and justice, the person's soul would be devoured by the monster Ammit, and they would be lost forever. Daily life in ancient Egypt was punctuated by an endless cycle of spiritual rituals, from the offering of food at shrines to the incantations chanted over the dead. The gods were ever present, and their approval or disapproval was seen as the key to life's success or failure. Religious anxiety was an inescapable part of Egyptian life, and this constant fear of divine judgment influenced everything from social behavior to political decisions. Rituals were not only religious in nature but also social. They brought people together in a collective effort to ensure the gods' favor and maintain order in the world. It was a way to reinforce community bonds, as well as an avenue to express one's devotion to the gods. At the same time, this overwhelming focus on divine favor created an environment in which people were constantly aware of their own impermanence and the ever-present fear of cosmic imbalance. Thus, while Egyptians may have lived under a powerful and organized system of religion, they were also trapped in a cycle of ritual and fear. The gods were not only worshipped, they were feared. The anxiety surrounding their judgment shaped the very foundation of ancient Egyptian society, influencing not only the daily lives of common people but also the decisions made by the pharaohs who ruled over them. In ancient Egypt, the fear of curses, demons, and the afterlife was deeply ingrained in the spiritual consciousness of the people. The Egyptians believed that the world was full of both divine forces and malevolent spirits, and the afterlife was not just a peaceful resting place, but a realm fraught with dangers. These fears were not limited to the physical world, but extended deeply into the magical and supernatural realms. The Egyptians lived in constant concern about their fate in the next world. The afterlife wasn't guaranteed for anyone. It was determined by how well a person lived. Their adherence to Mat, the principle of truth and order, and whether they had undergone proper rituals. But even for the righteous, the journey to the afterlife was perilous, and various magical forces, both good and evil, stood in the way of a peaceful transition. Curses were one of the most feared aspects of Egyptian religion. Curses were invoked in texts and inscriptions to protect sacred spaces, tombs, and temples from desecration. Tomb robbers were particularly at risk, as they were believed to be cursed with eternal misfortune for disturbing the resting place of the dead. The Egyptians believed that if someone violated a tomb or took something sacred, they would face divine retribution. These curses were often written in hieroglyphics and invoked the power of gods and spirits to punish the wrongdoers in ways that ranged from sickness to death. Some of these curses were believed to be so powerful that they could even haunt the offenders after death, condemning their souls to wander for eternity in a state of suffering. But curses weren't just something reserved for tombs or sacred sites. Demons and evil spirits were believed to be all around, lurking and capable of causing harm to the living. Ancient Egyptians had an extensive array of protective amulets and magical spells to shield themselves from these malevolent forces. Demons were believed to have the power to enter the body or soul of a person, causing illness, madness, or even death. They were often depicted as strange, grotesque creatures and were seen as agents of chaos who could disrupt the natural order. Magicians and priests played an essential role in keeping these forces at bay, using their knowledge of spells, incantations, and rituals to ward off demons and evil spirits. The afterlife itself was not a place of comfort or peace for everyone. It was viewed as a challenging journey, where the soul of the deceased had to navigate various obstacles. One of the most terrifying aspects of the afterlife was the weighing of the heart ceremony. In this process, the deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, representing truth and justice. If the heart was found to be too heavy with sin, it was devoured by Ammit, a demon with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hind quarters of a hippopotamus. Those who were devoured by Ammit were condemned to eternal oblivion, a fate worse than death. The belief in divine judgment and the fear of being devoured by Ammit created a deep anxiety surrounding death and the afterlife. People went to great lengths to ensure that they were worthy of entering the afterlife, following religious laws and offering sacrifices to the gods to avoid eternal damnation. Magical spells were an essential part of the Egyptians' preparation for the afterlife. The Book of the Dead is perhaps the most famous collection of spells, providing instructions for navigating the dangers of the underworld. These spells were carefully written and placed in the tombs of the dead to ensure their safe passage to the afterlife. They served as protections against evil spirits, demons, and the threats posed by the underworld. The Egyptians believed that the power of these magical texts would help guide the soul through the dangers of the afterlife, protecting it from obstacles like scorpions, snakes, and other monstrous creatures that were believed to inhabit the realm of the dead. Moreover, the Egyptians also had a fear of magical retaliation from those who were wronged in life. Spirits of the dead were believed to have the power to return and punish the living if they were not properly honored. This could manifest in the form of illness, accidents, or even bad luck. Because of this, great care was taken to ensure that the dead were properly buried, their names remembered, and offerings made to them regularly. If the dead were neglected or forgotten, their spirits could turn malevolent and seek revenge on the living. The fear of magical danger was pervasive in Egyptian society, and people took extensive precautions to protect themselves from it. Protective amulets, charms, and spells were worn on the body or placed in homes and tombs. These items were thought to have protective power, guarding their owners from demonic forces and ensuring their safety in the afterlife. Amulets shaped like scarabs, for example, were placed in tombs or worn as jewelry to protect the wearer from evil and to promote a safe journey in the afterlife. The belief in the supernatural in Egypt was not just limited to the fear of demons and curses. The Egyptians were acutely aware of the uncertainty of life and the chaos that could be caused by unseen forces. Their constant concern with the next world and the magical dangers that lay within it created a society where spiritual anxiety was always present. Every aspect of their lives, from their daily rituals to the way they dealt with death, was shaped by the fear of curses and evil forces. The Egyptians went to great lengths to ensure that their souls would be protected and that they would have a favorable judgment in the afterlife, as any misstep could result in their eternal torment. Mummification in ancient Egypt was not just a sacred practice. It was a gruesome, invasive, and sometimes horrifying process for anyone who might have been unlucky enough to witness it. Though it was ritualistically important, mummification was far from a gentle or peaceful procedure. The Egyptians believed that preserving the body was crucial for the soul's journey to the afterlife. The process involved a series of elaborate rituals, painful steps, and surgical procedures that would have been shocking and uncomfortable for any modern observer. The primary goal of mummification was to ensure the deceased's body would be preserved for eternity, allowing the soul to return and recognize it. But achieving this involved not just wrapping a body in cloth. The process took 70 days to complete and was both physically invasive and emotionally charged. Mummification was a highly specialized practice, typically performed by priests and embalmers who had an intimate understanding of the body, but the uninitiated would be horrified by the steps involved. The first step was to remove the internal organs. The body was laid out on a special table, and the stomach, lungs, liver, and intestines were carefully removed. The heart, however, was often left in place, as it was believed to be the center of intelligence and emotion. The brain was extracted by inserting a hook through the nostrils and pulling it out piece by piece, which sounds like a nightmarish procedure. The brain had no real value to the Egyptians in terms of the afterlife, as they believed the heart carried the true essence of the individual. The skull was then emptied, which could have been a grotesque and jarring sight. Once the organs were removed, they were carefully preserved in canopic jars. These jars were designed to hold each of the organs in a separate container, each marked with a symbol of a god for protection. The body itself was then treated with a mixture of natron, a naturally occurring salt that helped to dry out and dehydrate the corpse. This was an essential step, as dehydration was needed to prevent the body from decaying. For weeks, the body was left to dry, and this step alone would have been a stark and unsettling sight, as the flesh would begin to harden and shrivel in the intense heat. Once the body was sufficiently dried, it was then treated with oils and resins to preserve the skin and flesh. This stage was meant to protect the body and give it a lifelike appearance, which was important for the deceased to be recognized in the afterlife. At this point, the body was often wrapped in linen bandages, and amulets and other magical items were placed between the layers to ensure protection in the journey to the afterlife. The final stages of mummification involved the ritualistic wrapping of the body. Priests would carefully wrap the body in layers of linen bandages, often using hundreds of yards of cloth. This was a meticulous process, and each layer of linen would be sprinkled with resins or incense to seal the body. The wrapping would also include magical incantations written on pieces of linen or papyrus. These prayers and spells were intended to protect the deceased's body from evil spirits and to ensure the soul's safe passage into the afterlife. The body was then placed in a sarcophagus, a large stone coffin, where it would remain sealed, awaiting the day of judgment. For anyone witnessing this process, it would have been a visually disturbing and emotionally unsettling experience. The entire procedure was designed not only to preserve the body, but to ensure that the soul could pass into the afterlife without danger. However, the invasive and often gruesome nature of the process made it difficult for any onlookers to separate the sacred from the horrifying reality of dismemberment, dehydration, and preservation. For the ancient Egyptians, though, mummification was a necessary and sacred duty. It was seen as the ultimate expression of respect for the deceased. The physical and emotional discomforts of mummification were accepted as part of the greater good, ensuring the eternal existence of the soul and its ability to enter the afterlife. But for the modern viewer, the process would appear far more like a gruesome procedure than a reverent ritual. The extraction of organs, the brain hook, the preservation oils, and the long hours spent wrapping the body in bandages all make mummification seem like a gruesome horror show. It's difficult to imagine how anyone could witness such an intense bodily invasion without feeling some level of revulsion or distress. Even though it was a part of their deeply held religious beliefs, mummification would undoubtedly be a shocking sight to behold, an experience that would blend religion with macabre reality. Yet for the Egyptians, it was the only way to ensure that the deceased would live on forever, untouched by the ravages of time. In ancient Egypt, medicine was a fascinating blend of magic, rituals, and guesswork. The Egyptians did not have the scientific understanding of health and disease that we have today, so their methods of healing were based on a mix of spiritual beliefs and practical remedies that were often ineffective or downright dangerous. In fact, many of their medical practices would be seen today as primitive, and in some cases harmful. One of the most common medical practices in ancient Egypt was bloodletting, a technique that was believed to help balance the body's internal humors and drive out sickness. This method involved cutting open veins or arteries to release blood, which was thought to cleanse the body and restore health. However, there was little understanding of the dangers of blood loss, and many people likely suffered from infections or severe blood loss as a result of this practice. It wasn't unusual for a patient to leave the doctor's tent in worse condition than when they arrived. Another aspect of Egyptian medicine was the use of animal dung as a common remedy for a variety of ailments. Feces from animals like cows, goats, and dogs were used in ointments, poultices, and even drinks, believed to cure everything from infections to digestive problems. The Egyptians had no concept of bacteria or germs, so they thought that using animal waste was a way to restore balance and heal the body. The irony of using something so unsanitary to promote health would not be lost on us today, but in the context of their world, this was a standard practice. While many treatments were based on magical beliefs, there were also herbal remedies used for more practical purposes. The Egyptians had a wealth of knowledge about plants and herbs, and they used them to treat a wide range of conditions. For example, willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, was used to relieve pain and reduce inflammation. Garlic was believed to have healing properties, particularly for infectious diseases. Honey was used as an antiseptic, and aloe vera was applied to wounds and burns. While some of these remedies had a degree of effectiveness, they were often not enough to combat the more serious diseases or injuries people faced. In addition to these treatments, the Egyptians believed that prayers, rituals, and spells were essential for healing. The gods were invoked to drive out evil spirits or disease, and many doctors acted as priests who combined medical treatments with spiritual ceremonies. Incantations were recited over patients, and amulets or magical objects were used to ward off harmful forces. Healing was often a spiritual matter, as much as it was a physical one. For example, Imhotep, one of the most famous figures in Egyptian medicine, was also regarded as a god of healing, and people would pray to him for help with illnesses. Patients were often encouraged to fast, pray, and perform rituals in addition to receiving medical treatments. Doctors in ancient Egypt were highly respected, but their training was very different from modern medical education. They learned their craft from priests and elders, often through a mix of practical experience and spiritual knowledge passed down through generations. Some of the more advanced physicians specialized in specific areas like surgery, dentistry, or gynecology, while others worked more generally to treat ailments. But regardless of their specialty, their treatments were often based on trial and error, rather than scientific understanding.
Surgical procedures were another aspect of Egyptian medicine that would have been disturbing for anyone to witness. Doctors performed surgeries such as trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to treat head injuries or mental illness, and amputations for severely injured limbs. These procedures were often performed with stone tools, as metal instruments were rare. The Egyptians also had a basic understanding of anatomy and were able to perform certain medical procedures with impressive precision. However, without anesthesia or antiseptics, these surgeries would have been excruciatingly painful and dangerous. In terms of warfare, the Egyptians were not strangers to injuries, and their medical practices had to adapt to the needs of soldiers. Battle wounds were common, and soldiers often received care from military physicians who treated injuries ranging from sword cuts to arrow wounds. However, the treatment of such injuries was limited to basic wound care, like cleaning the wounds, applying herbal remedies, and sometimes using sutures to close the wound. Many soldiers likely succumbed to infection or complications due to the lack of proper medical treatment and sanitation. One of the most glaring aspects of Egyptian medicine was the absence of an understanding of germs or disease transmission. The Egyptians did not know that diseases could spread from person to person, or that poor hygiene could lead to infections. Their treatment methods, though innovative in their own time, often lacked the scientific rigor we now take for granted. Infections caused by unsanitary conditions were common, and epidemics could devastate populations. Plagues and fevers were often seen as divine punishments or the work of evil spirits, and the people relied on magical remedies or divine intervention to cure them. The practice of medicine in ancient Egypt was a complex and deeply spiritual endeavor, but it was far from effective by modern standards. While the Egyptians made important strides in fields like surgery, dentistry, and herbal medicine, their reliance on magic, superstition, and trial and error meant that many of their treatments were ineffective, dangerous, or simply based on false beliefs. In many ways, their understanding of medicine was a precursor to modern practices, but it still relied heavily on the mystical and unknown. In ancient Egypt, life was brutal, and the life expectancy was alarmingly short, typically ranging between 30 to 40 years. However, this doesn't mean that the average person lived to their 30s or 40s. The life expectancy is heavily influenced by high rates of infant mortality, which brought down the overall average. In reality, many children did not survive past their early years, and it was not unusual for infants to die from diseases, malnutrition, or accidents before they reached their 5th birthday. In fact, if you made it past childhood, you had a better chance of living into your 20s or 30s, though this would still be considered an early death by modern standards. Children were particularly vulnerable in ancient Egypt. The infant mortality rate was extraordinarily high, with many babies dying from diseases, poor nutrition, or the harsh environmental conditions. Dysentery, malaria, respiratory infections, and intestinal parasites were common threats, and with no access to modern medicine or hygiene practices, these illnesses would often claim the lives of young children. The high death rate among children meant that it was common for families to experience the heartache of losing a child, often more than once. For this reason, Egyptians placed great emphasis on protection rituals, spiritual guardianship, and blessings to ensure the survival of their young. Even if you managed to survive childhood, adulthood was still fraught with risks. Diseases that would be easily treatable today were deadly in ancient Egypt. Infections resulting from cuts, wounds, or broken bones could easily lead to death due to the lack of antibiotics and proper sterilization techniques. The absence of modern medical knowledge meant that a seemingly minor injury could quickly become life-threatening if it became infected. Bloodletting or magical treatments meant to heal wounds often did more harm than good, and complications from untreated infections or injuries were common causes of death. Women faced particular challenges in their lifetime, as childbirth was often a deadly endeavor. Infant mortality rates were high, and maternal death during childbirth was also common due to infections, complications, and the lack of proper medical care. The risk of childbirth-related death meant that many women faced a high mortality rate in their 20s and 30s, a stark contrast to the safety that modern medicine provides during childbirth today. Egyptian women were also highly exposed to health risks due to the hard manual labor they often performed, which could lead to chronic health issues. In ancient Egypt, physical trauma also played a huge role in a person's life expectancy. Due to their society's reliance on manual labor, people frequently faced serious injuries, often from accidents, combat, or construction work. Whether it was quarrying stones, hauling materials, or farming, physical labor was a daily part of life, and the harsh conditions could easily lead to broken bones, wounds, or musculoskeletal injuries that could lead to permanent disabilities or even death. In the absence of effective pain management, surgical procedures, or proper rehabilitation, even a minor injury could evolve into something far more serious. The risk of warfare and violence was also an ever-present danger in Egypt. Egypt was frequently involved in battles and conquests, and soldiers often suffered life-threatening injuries. In war, the lack of effective medical care meant that many soldiers died from battle wounds that today would be easily treatable. Soldiers who survived battle injuries had a higher chance of dying from infections, while the Egyptians also had no way of combating diseases like typhus or plague, which could ravage both soldiers and civilians alike. Living under the brutal conditions of ancient warfare, difficult labor, and a lack of medical advancements, disease, injury, and childbirth complications contributed to the short life expectancy in ancient Egypt. Even if someone did manage to survive past childhood and avoid the numerous risks associated with daily life, their chances of dying before they reached their 50s or 60s were slim. Only those who were fortunate enough to avoid illness, injury, or disease could live into old age, and many people who did survive into their later years faced debilitating illnesses that today would likely be manageable or treatable. In conclusion, the short life expectancy in ancient Egypt was primarily driven by the high risk of childhood diseases, poor medical care, infectious diseases, and the hard realities of daily life. The Egyptians made significant advancements in medicine. But these advancements were not enough to overcome the challenges posed by a world where medical knowledge was primitive and the conditions of life were unforgiving. Despite these hardships, the Egyptians revered the afterlife and the belief that life continued after death, which led to their intense focus on preserving the body through mummification and spiritual rituals. Yet, for the vast majority of Egyptians, death came far too soon, often leaving little room for the opportunities, experiences, and joys that come with a longer life. In ancient Egypt, warfare was a constant reality, especially during the reign of the powerful pharaohs. Egypt's military was essential in protecting the kingdom's borders and expanding its territory, but for the soldiers, the experience of war was brutal and dangerous. One of the most shocking aspects of ancient Egyptian warfare was the minimal protection soldiers had when going into battle.
Armor was almost non-existent for the average soldier. Unlike today, where soldiers are equipped with advanced armor, helmets, and shields, Egyptian soldiers went to war with very little to protect them. The elite warriors may have worn light armor such as leather or bronze chest plates, but for the majority, protection was limited to small shields and helmets made of bronze or wood. Some soldiers used tunic-like garments that offered little defense against blows or missiles like arrows or spears. For most Egyptian soldiers, the battlefield was a terrifying place where arrows flew from long distances and spears were hurled into crowds of soldiers. Without adequate armor, the risk of injury was incredibly high. Arrows, especially those tipped with bronze or stone, could penetrate the light protection they had. Injuries from sword strikes or blows from battle axes were common, and without any form of proper treatment, they would often lead to infection or death. The lack of armor wasn't the only challenge for soldiers in ancient Egypt. Fighting in the heat of the desert or near the Nile River meant that soldiers had to deal with the oppressive heat while wearing minimal clothing. The combination of extreme temperatures and lack of protection made the experience of being a soldier exhausting and potentially life-threatening. Without the cooling systems or water supplies modern soldiers rely on, ancient Egyptian soldiers were at the mercy of the environment. Tactics in battle were also primitive. Egyptian soldiers fought primarily with spears, swords, bow and arrows, and chariots, relying on numbers and strategy to defeat their enemies. Chariots were a significant advantage for Egyptian armies, but the soldiers still had to be highly skilled to operate them effectively. These chariots were fast, and they provided a tactical edge, but they still left the soldiers inside vulnerable to injury, especially without the protection of armor.
Additionally, the mental and physical toll of constant warfare cannot be overstated. Soldiers were often drafted or enlisted for long periods of time and had to endure not only the grueling nature of combat, but also the exposure to disease in the harsh environment. Disease spread rapidly in armies, and soldiers often died not from wounds inflicted by their enemies, but from illnesses like dysentery, malaria, or infections that could spread through unsanitary conditions. The brutality of war was not limited to combat injuries. It also involved the psychological strain of long campaigns, the constant fear of death, and the looming threat of enslavement or execution for those who failed in battle. Prisoners of war could face horrific fates, and many were executed or forced into slavery as part of the spoils of war. What's even more remarkable is that, despite the relatively minimal protection soldiers had, Egypt's military was highly effective for centuries. This was due to their organization, strategy, and the skill of their soldiers, even when they had to face overwhelming odds in battle. While their lack of armor meant that soldiers were highly vulnerable, it also meant that they had to be highly mobile and agile, adapting to the demands of warfare with speed and dexterity, rather than relying on heavy defense. However, even with their incredible strategies and bravery, the constant nature of war in ancient Egypt meant that soldiers faced a grim fate, either an early death in battle, a slow death from illness or injury, or a long life filled with wounds, scars, and trauma. The lack of proper armor meant that survival in war wasn't just about fighting skills, it was about luck. In conclusion, war in ancient Egypt was a grueling, constant reality, especially for the common soldiers who lacked the protection and equipment that we would consider standard in modern warfare. Despite their skill and bravery, the absence of armor, combined with the high risks of battle, left soldiers extremely vulnerable. Their lives were often short, marked by violence, wounds, and death, making their role in ancient Egyptian society one of constant hardship. The battlefield was a terrifying place, and for many soldiers it was a place where survival was never guaranteed. In ancient Egypt,
Death was seen not as the end, but as a transition to another world, a journey to the afterlife. How you were buried, the items you were buried with, and the rituals that accompanied your death largely depended on your social status and wealth. This meant that some Egyptians were buried with all of their worldly possessions, while others were buried with little to nothing at all. For the elite, including pharaohs, nobles, and wealthy individuals, their tombs were vast and filled with treasures meant to ensure a comfortable afterlife. They believed that the gods would judge their actions, and to pass into the afterlife, they needed to be equipped with the proper tools, offerings, and symbols of status. These tombs were often lavishly furnished, with items ranging from gold, jewels, and furniture to everyday objects that might be needed in the afterlife, like food and drink. Furniture, statues, chariots, and even servants, sometimes represented by servant statues, were often placed in tombs to accompany the deceased into the next world. This practice was rooted in the belief that the afterlife was a continuation of life on earth, and thus the deceased needed everything they had during their lifetime to ensure their survival in the afterlife. One of the most famous examples of this practice is the burial of Tutankhamun. When his tomb was discovered in 1922, it was found to be filled with an incredible array of treasures, from golden masks and jewels to musical instruments and chariots. This was a testament to the wealth and status that came with being a pharaoh, and it was believed that these treasures would help him in his journey through the afterlife. However, for the common people, the situation was very different. Most Egyptians in the lower social ranks did not have the resources to be buried with a vast array of possessions. Their tombs were much simpler, often just small pit graves in the sand. While they might have been buried with a few items like simple pottery, food offerings, or personal items, these were nothing compared to the elaborate grave goods placed in the tombs of the wealthy. Peasants, laborers, and those who didn't possess high social rank were likely buried without the luxuries of the elite. These individuals might have been buried with only a few linen cloths and tools that they used in their lives, with little to no attempt at preserving their bodies for the afterlife.
The belief in the afterlife meant that everyone had some kind of preparation for death, but the quantity and quality of what was included in the grave were directly related to their status in life. Wealthier individuals could afford mummification, a complex and costly process that would help preserve their bodies for the afterlife, while poorer people might have been buried in simpler ways, without the same efforts to preserve their physical remains. For those who could not afford elaborate tombs or mummification, death often meant a quick burial, with little fanfare or ceremony. The poor could still hope for an afterlife, but they lacked the material wealth to make it as comfortable as those who were more fortunate. The practice of being buried with one's possessions also served as a reflection of the Egyptian worldview. The afterlife was a continuation of life, and it was believed that one's status, wealth, and actions on earth would determine what they experienced in the next world. Therefore, people wanted to take with them items that reflected their status, their life's work, and their desires. If you were a craftsman, you might be buried with tools of your trade. If you were a farmer, you might have farming implements buried with you. If you were a noble or royal, your tomb would be filled with anything that symbolized your wealth and power. Interestingly, not all Egyptians were buried with the same belief in a lavish afterlife. Some believed that the soul was the most important thing to preserve, and thus the body itself didn't require the same lavish treatment. Even so, the disparity between the burials of the elite and the commoners highlights the sharp class divides in ancient Egyptian society. The rich, through their wealth and social rank, had access to resources that could make their death and journey to the afterlife more comfortable, while the poor had to make do with little.
At times, the Egyptians also relied on family members to provide for the deceased. As a result, some people may have been buried with items like jewelry, clothing, or personal effects passed down through generations, which could have been a way for loved ones to ensure that the deceased had something of value to carry with them into the afterlife. However, these practices were far more common among the wealthier members of society. In conclusion, in ancient Egypt, your social rank and wealth played a huge role in determining how you would be buried. The elite were often buried with an abundance of treasures to ensure a comfortable transition into the afterlife, while the poor were buried with much less or nothing at all. This disparity in burial practices serves as a stark reminder of the rigid social hierarchy that governed ancient Egyptian society. Your wealth could not only dictate your status during your lifetime, but also the comfort and luxury of your journey into the afterlife. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a ruler. He was seen as a living god, the divine intermediary between the gods and the people. His power was absolute, and his word was law. The idea of questioning or challenging the pharaoh was unthinkable in Egyptian society, as his authority was divinely ordained. This concept of divine kingship meant that the pharaoh's actions, decisions, and commands were considered the will of the gods themselves. To go against the pharaoh was not just an act of defiance, but a spiritual and cosmic violation, and it could lead to severe consequences, often catastrophic. The pharaoh was considered the embodiment of the gods on earth, particularly the god Ra, the sun god. As the living god, he was responsible for the welfare and prosperity of the land, as well as the order and justice of the society. This divine status gave the pharaoh an unquestionable authority over every aspect of life in Egypt. He could decide life and death, approve laws, issue decrees, and even change the course of history with a single command. His word was final, and no one, not even his closest advisors, had the right to challenge him. Because the pharaoh was considered a god, his authority extended to every corner of the kingdom, from the most powerful nobles to the humblest peasant. Even the law itself was based on the pharaoh's will. Judicial decisions, like those involving criminal charges or land disputes, would be made in the name of the pharaoh, and his judges were simply his agents. When it came to major decisions or state matters, the pharaoh would consult his advisors, but ultimately the final word was his. To disagree with the pharaoh was seen as not just an act of rebellion against a ruler, but as a rebellion against the gods themselves, and this was something that Egyptians were highly cautious about.
What made the pharaoh's power so unique was that it was often absolute and unchallenged. There was no separation of powers like we have in modern democracies. The pharaoh controlled everything. He was the head of the state, the military, the judiciary, and the religious system. There was no parliament or elected officials to counterbalance his decisions. Laws, taxes, and punishments were all implemented according to his will, and his decisions could affect the lives of millions. Even a small decree from the pharaoh could drastically change the fate of individuals and entire communities. If a pharaoh decided to build a monument or launch a military campaign, there was no discussion about the consequences. The people had to accept the decision as the will of the gods. The immense power of the pharaoh was not just theoretical, it was very much real and visible in everyday life. For example, the pharaoh could order the construction of massive pyramids or temples, and entire communities would be mobilized to work on them, regardless of the personal cost to individuals. People didn't dare to refuse the pharaoh's commands because the consequences were often severe. Punishments for disobedience or defiance could be as harsh as exile, slavery, or even death. The idea of punishment was not just about maintaining order, but also about pleasing the gods. If the pharaoh's authority was challenged, it was seen as a disruption of the divine cosmic balance,
which could lead to misfortune, disease, or even natural disasters. The fear of the pharaoh's power was so ingrained in Egyptian society that rebellions against his rule were incredibly rare. Even if there were instances of discontent, people rarely dared to openly defy the pharaoh. Instead, uprisings were usually suppressed quickly, with harsh retribution. In ancient Egypt, the government relied heavily on a system of taxation to support the vast empire and fund monumental projects, military campaigns, and the upkeep of the royal court. Taxation was not just a financial burden. It was a key tool for maintaining the pharaoh's power, ensuring the prosperity of the elite, and supporting the functioning of Egyptian society. But it came at a heavy price, and the tax burden was often felt most acutely by the poor and the working classes, who had to pay in grain, livestock, or labor. Those who failed to meet these tax demands faced severe punishment, making the system not only oppressive, but a constant source of anxiety for those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. One of the primary forms of taxation was paid in grain, the staple food of Egypt. The Nile's fertile soil made Egypt's agriculture incredibly productive, and grain was essential for the economy. However, the amount of grain that people were required to pay in taxes was often crushing. Farmers, who made up the majority of the population, were tasked with growing enough food for themselves, their families, and the entire nation. After ensuring their own survival, they were required to give a large portion of their harvest to the state. The grain tax could be as much as a third of a farmer's entire crop, depending on the local regulations and the pharaoh's needs. For poorer farmers, this left little to feed their families, forcing them into debt or poverty. For those who couldn't pay in grain, the alternative was often to give up livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, or camels, which were crucial for farming, transportation, and personal survival. Without these animals, many people faced even greater hardship, as their ability to produce food or generate income was severely limited. For poorer families, losing livestock was a devastating blow, as it could push them further into poverty and lead to a life of laboring for others just to survive. In addition to grain and livestock, many Egyptians also had to pay taxes in the form of labor. This was particularly true for those in rural areas, where farmers were often forced to contribute work days to royal projects. These could include working on the construction of pyramids, temples, and other grand structures, or even contributing to military efforts or irrigation projects. The labor tax was effectively forced labor, with no compensation beyond the satisfaction of fulfilling the pharaoh's demand. Farmers and peasants had little say in when they were expected to work, and the work was often grueling, performed under the hot desert sun for long hours. Many Egyptians found themselves in a position where they worked tirelessly throughout the year, only to find their hard-earned crops or animals taken from them in the form of taxes, leaving them with little to live on.
Failure to meet the tax demands, whether in grain, livestock, or labor, had severe consequences. The government, backed by the pharaoh's power, enforced tax collection with punishments that could range from beatings and imprisonment to forced labor in the king's service or worse. In some cases, people who were unable to pay their taxes could be sold into slavery to make up for the debts they owed. The tax collectors were feared figures, often seen as corrupt and brutal, demanding not only the required amount, but sometimes more, under the threat of punishment. The poor were often hit hardest by these taxes. Since they had little to begin with, even a small increase in taxation could mean the difference between survival and starvation. If the Nile floods failed to bring adequate water to the crops, making the harvest poor, or if a plague struck their livestock, they were still expected to meet the same tax demands. This constant pressure to produce for the government while struggling to support their families created a deep sense of resentment and inequality.
As a result, there were occasional revolts or uprisings from those who could no longer bear the burden of taxes, though they were usually quickly suppressed due to the pharaoh's vast resources and control over the military. This oppressive taxation system was justified in the eyes of the ruling class by the idea that the pharaoh was a divine ruler who had the right to claim resources from the land and its people. The tax system was designed not only to support the royal family and the elite, but also to fund the lavish temples and monuments that honored the gods, many of which were built through the forced labor of the common people. The pharaoh used the taxes to maintain his image as a god on earth, ensuring that Egypt remained a powerful and prosperous empire, while the wealth disparity between the elite and the poor grew wider. The wealth generated by these taxes funded a massive bureaucracy that ensured that the rich lived in luxury while the poor toiled endlessly. The people of Egypt were thus caught in a cycle of poverty, taxation, and labor, with little hope for escape from the system. Those at the bottom had to live with the constant fear that their crops wouldn't grow, their animals would be seized, or they would be caught up in the demands of forced labor, with little chance of ever rising above their station. In conclusion, taxation in ancient Egypt was not just a financial burden. It was a system of control. The pharaoh's taxes ensured that the elite and the state had all they needed to maintain their power, but it was oppressive for the poor. Forced to give up their grain, livestock, or labor, the lower classes faced immense hardship. Failure to meet these demands resulted in harsh punishment, and the constant threat of punishment created a society in which the poor had little hope of improvement. This deeply entrenched system of taxation reinforced the power and wealth of the elite while maintaining the pharaoh's unchallenged rule. And so, our journey through a single harsh day in ancient Egypt comes to an end. A world with no escape from the sun, no privacy, not even a meal to ease the exhaustion. And yet, people kept living, building, dreaming, just as we do in a different world. Good night.